What if I told you that the most dangerous part of your mind is not outside of you, but hidden inside you? Carl Jung, one of the greatest thinkers in psychology, believed that every human being carries a dark side, repressed impulses, hidden fears, denied desires, and truths that few people have the courage to face. And the most frightening part is this: the more you try to run from that darkness, the more power it gains. In this video, you're going to discover Carl Jung's darkest psychological theories, deep, unsettling ideas that can completely change the way you see yourself. When Jung talks about the shadow, he is not describing some kind of monster hidden inside the human soul, as if evil were always something dramatic or extreme. Most of the time, the shadow is more ordinary, more personal, and more uncomfortable than that. It shows up in the things a person does not want to admit about themselves. Envy pretending to be a sense of justice. Vanity dressed up as humility. Cruelty disguised as honesty. Resentment presenting itself as caution. For Jung, the conscious personality we show to the world is only one part of who we are. The other part gathers everything that has been repressed, forgotten, denied, or felt to be morally uncomfortable. It is this hidden territory that he calls the shadow. In IN, Jung puts it very directly when he says that everyone carries a shadow, and that the less it is recognized in conscious life, the darker and denser it becomes. That is what makes this theory so disturbing and so powerful. The shadow does not belong only to bad people. It belongs to everyone. A kind person may hide aggression. A disciplined person may hide a desire for chaos. A moralist may hide the same impulses they condemn in others. In that way, Jung breaks with the comforting fantasy that maturity simply means collecting visible virtues. It does not. In this view, growing up also means realizing that the conscious self is not the only one running the inner house. There is a psychological basement full of contents that remain alive, even after being pushed out of the image a person has built of themselves. And pushing something out does not mean getting rid of it. Jung kept insisting on this. What is repressed does not disappear. It simply begins to act in indirect ways. That is why the shadow has such dramatic force. The more someone invests in appearing flawless, the more dangerous it can be to stay disconnected from what they really feel. A person may spend years believing they are always balanced, generous, and rational, until a burst of jealousy, an explosion of anger, or a desire to humiliate someone suddenly reveals a crack. And the shock does not come only from the impulse itself, but from the fact that it contradicts the self-image that was built so carefully. The shadow hurts because it humiliates the ego's narcissism. It forces us to let go of the illusion of purity. At that point, Jung comes close to an ancient insight, almost Socratic in spirit. Knowing yourself has never been a comfortable journey. But in Jung, self-knowledge does not reveal only ignorance. It also reveals moral conflict and inner contradiction. This view also connects with a much broader philosophical tradition. The Stoics, like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, already warned that human beings must watch their inner movements carefully, because the soul easily deceives itself about its own motives. St. Augustine, in a different context, also recognized the inner division of the will. Wanting the good is not enough to fully live it out. Centuries later, Nietzsche would tear apart the civilized image of man by showing how many underground forces act behind declared morality. Jung inherits something from that whole background. He looks at the modern person and says that consciousness is smaller than it imagines, less transparent than it believes, and less innocent than it would like to be. The shadow, then, is not just one detail of personality. It is a limit placed on the vanity of consciousness. But there is one essential point that makes this theory richer than a simple exposure of the ugly side of the soul. The shadow does not contain only socially condemned impulses. It can also hold vitality, spontaneity, creativity, and strength that were pushed down because they did not fit the persona, that social mask the individual learned to wear in order to be accepted. Someone raised to always be nice may have buried their ability to set boundaries. Someone trained to be strong all the time may have pushed their vulnerability and tenderness into the shadow. That is why integrating the shadow does not mean letting out the worst in yourself. It means recognizing what has been exiled from consciousness and bringing it back into psychic life in a responsible way. Jung is not saying that a person should become a prisoner of dark impulses. He is saying they should stop being ruled by them without knowing it. And here is one of Jung's most human lessons. What we refuse to face in ourselves often comes back in the way we judge other people. A person who denies their own aggression tends to see hostility everywhere. Someone who cannot admit their own ambition accuses every successful person of moral corruption. Someone who rejects their most uncomfortable desires becomes obsessively outraged by the desires of others. So the shadow is not only an inner problem. It can poison relationships, worldviews, and even collective conflicts. Instead of recognizing, "This also exists in me," the person prefers to say, "This exists in them." That is one of the roots of hypocrisy, and also of intolerance. The seriousness of this idea lies in the fact that Jung does not offer cheap comfort. He does not promise that if we look inward, we will find only light, pure essence, or an ideal version of ourselves. He says with rare courage that self-knowledge requires facing what wounds our moral pride. And that is hard, because no one likes to discover that they are also capable of pettiness, cowardice, or even a desire for destruction. Even so, Jung saw in this a real possibility for transformation. Instead of living controlled by unconscious forces, a person can gain some clarity. Instead of pretending to be whole, they can become more genuine. And maybe that is exactly why the theory of the shadow still feels so current. It reminds us that the danger is not only in having a dark side, but in sincerely believing that we do not. There is a very human mistake that almost everyone makes: imagining that whatever has been pushed down inside has disappeared. Jung goes in the opposite direction. For him, nothing psychological simply vanishes because consciousness has rejected it. What has been denied stays alive, keeps working, and keeps looking for some way to express itself. And that is exactly where the danger of repressing the shadow begins. The more a person insists on seeing themselves as completely good, balanced, and full of light, the more vulnerable they become to inner explosions that seem to come out of nowhere, but were actually being prepared for years through denial. Jung describes the shadow as the hidden, repressed part of the personality, which shows that the problem is not only that we have it, but that we treat it as if it did not exist. This is one of the most uncomfortable ideas in Jungian psychology. Repression does not destroy the impulse. It only pushes it into less visible areas of the soul. And what sinks into the unconscious does not become weaker. Very often, it becomes more independent. Instead of being recognized, examined, and moderated, it starts acting indirectly. Repressed anger may come back as constant sarcasm. Envy may dress itself up as moral criticism. Fear may turn into excessive control. Denied vanity may appear as the need to quietly humiliate others. Jung understood that modern people tend to trust too much in what they can say about themselves. But psychic life is not limited to what the ego is willing to admit. There are underground forces working precisely because they were pushed out of the official story a person tells about themselves. In other words, repressing the shadow does not make someone better. It only makes that person less aware of what is driving them. And that is serious, because what is not seen cannot be governed. Jung insisted that the therapeutic process requires bringing unconscious elements into awareness in order to integrate the personality. The important word here is integrate, not unleash and not destroy. What has been repressed needs to be brought into consciousness so it can be understood and transformed. When that does not happen, a person runs the risk of being led by impulses they would swear they do not have. That is the real drama. The individual believes they are acting in the name of reason, justice, or common sense, when in fact they are being pushed by contents they never wanted to recognize. That is why Jung saw so much danger in an overly pure self-image. The more flawless someone needs to appear to themselves, the more unbearable it becomes to admit aggression, resentment, the desire to dominate, or pleasure in destruction. But the unconscious does not respect the moral vanity of the ego. It eventually demands attention, and it usually does so in moments of weakness, frustration, or crisis. The calm person suddenly explodes. The person who is always kind becomes cruel for no reason. The moralist unexpectedly gives in to impulses they used to condemn. What looks like a sudden contradiction is often just the return of what was repressed for too long. It is not some strange accident, but a kind of psychic compensation. The rejected energy looks for a way out, and when it cannot find a conscious path, it usually finds a distorted one. This insight brings Jung close to an important philosophical tradition. The Greeks already distrusted the person who never examined themselves. Socrates made self-knowledge an ethical demand. The Stoics warned that ignored passions enslave the soul. Nietzsche showed that many moral attitudes hide impulses that are less noble than we would like to admit. Jung gathers something from all of that and pushes it further in psychological language. It is not enough to defend high values. We also have to honestly investigate what real forces are at work inside us. Because when repression replaces inner examination, a person does not overcome the conflict. They simply lose touch with it. And an unconscious conflict is usually more dangerous than a recognized one. Another important point is that the repressed shadow rarely shows itself openly at first. It prefers what is indirect, ambiguous, and disguised. Instead of an obvious burst of rage, it may appear as poisonous irony. Instead of physical violence, it may show up as emotional sabotage. Instead of admitting, "I want to hurt," the person convinces themselves they are only setting boundaries or telling the truth. This is one of the darkest sides of repression. It not only hides the impulse, it also creates elegant justifications for it. The individual continues to see themselves as right while the shadow acts underneath the surface. Destruction then does not happen only in dramatic acts. It slips into daily life, into words, gestures, silences, and small cruelties that society often accepts. Jung also saw that what is repressed inside the individual is often projected outward. A person who cannot admit their own hostility starts seeing threats everywhere. Someone who represses ambition accuses others of being obsessed with power. Someone who denies their less noble desires becomes fierce in condemning those same desires in other people. At that point, repression of the shadow stops being only a private issue and becomes a relational, moral, and even social one. Because the evil not recognized in oneself finds relief by locating itself in someone else. This dynamic feeds hypocrisy, resentment, and persecution. Jung warned in different contexts that entire human groups can be driven by this mechanism when they project everything they refuse in themselves onto some outside enemy. But there is an important caution here. Recognizing the danger of repression does not mean praising raw impulse. Jung is not saying we should automatically obey anger, jealousy, or the desire to hurt. His point is more demanding than that. He is saying a person must see, name, and consciously endure what exists inside them so they are not possessed by those forces. In Jungian terms, the greatest danger is not feeling a dark impulse. It is being ruled by it without knowing it. That is why integrating the shadow is a task of maturity, not permissiveness. It is the effort to replace blindness with awareness at the deepest level. Repressing the shadow seems like an elegant solution, but it comes with a high cost. Consciousness keeps its image of purity, but loses depth, truth, and control. And life, sooner or later, exposes that fantasy. Jung forces us to face a harsh reality. What we refuse in ourselves does not stay still in the dark. It keeps acting, keeps pressing, and keeps searching for a way through. When recognized, it can be worked through. When repressed, it can become destructive. And maybe that is the most serious part of the whole lesson. The danger is not only that the dark side exists, but that we imagine denying it is the same as overcoming it. Very often, the evil we condemn most strongly in other people is not what we understand best, but what we can least bear to recognize in ourselves. This is one of Jung's sharpest ideas about the human mind. For him, projection is a mechanism through which unconscious contents, especially those connected to the shadow, are pushed outward and seen as if they belonged only to someone else. Instead of admitting their own aggression, envy, cowardice, hunger for power, or cruelty, a person begins to see those same traits with almost obsessive intensity in other people, groups, or enemies. Jung put this in a memorable way in Ion. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. In other words, what we refuse to face in ourselves comes back in the outer world wearing a strange face. Even though its source is deeply personal, this theory is disturbing because it tears apart a very common belief, the idea that our moral outrage is always proof of clear vision. Jung would not say that every criticism of someone else is projection, but he would insist that certain exaggerated reactions reveal something more than objective judgment. When someone becomes overly upset by a trait in another person, they may be standing in front of an involuntary mirror. The shadow, precisely because it is made of denied or repressed parts of the personality, looks for indirect ways to show itself. Projection is one of those ways. It protects the ego's self-image because it allows the person to keep seeing themselves as just decent and aware, while placing onto someone else everything that threatens that image. That is why projection is not just a mistake in perception. It is also a narcissistic defense. What makes it even more unsettling is that this process usually comes with sincerity. The person truly believes the problem exists only outside of them. The moralist who never admits their own ambition sees corruption everywhere. The person who represses hostility feels surrounded by aggressive enemies. The one who cannot stand their own weakness looks at weakness in others with contempt. In these cases, the other person becomes the stage on which the soul acts out a conflict it does not want to recognize inside. Jung connected this mechanism to the fact that the shadow is, to a great extent, the thing a person has no wish to be. The more incompatible a content feels with conscious identity, the more likely it is to be pushed out of self-image and return in projected form. This is where the theory takes on a deep ethical meaning. Because projecting evil onto others is not just a private mistake. It is a way of escaping responsibility for oneself. As long as a person stays busy locating darkness only outside, they avoid the painful task of recognizing their own part in psychic life. Jung saw this as a major obstacle to maturity. Consciousness prefers to believe that evil belongs to others, rivals, traitors, outsiders, ideological enemies, groups that provoke fear. But this ease in naming external monsters may hide an enormous difficulty in tolerating one's own inner conflict. And a person who cannot face the truth about themselves runs the risk of becoming morally dangerous precisely because they feel too innocent. This idea places Jung close to an old philosophical tradition. Socrates already taught that ignorance of oneself is one of the deepest forms of illusion. The Stoics warned that unexamined passions take control of the soul. Nietzsche showed how seemingly noble values can hide resentment and the will to power. Jung translates this problem into psychological language. What consciousness does not integrate tends to reappear in a distorted way in the perception of the world. One famous idea, often linked to his thought, says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. That expresses this logic well. The inner conflict, when not recognized, looks for an external stage where it can act itself out in everyday life. This helps explain why some people seem to be in constant war with the faults of others. It is not that the fault does not exist in the world. Often it does. The question is the emotional intensity with which it is perceived, hunted down, and condemned. Projection does not invent everything out of nothing, but it exaggerates, fixates, simplifies, and turns the other person into a container for something that also belongs to the one doing the projecting. Instead of seeing a complex person with both strengths and flaws, the projecting person sees a symbol of the evil they are fighting. And this movement has something seductive about it, because it simplifies moral reality. I stay on the side of good, and the other carries the evil. The psyche loves these clean divisions. Jung deeply distrusted them. When this mechanism expands to the collective level, the danger grows. Jung repeatedly warned that projection of the shadow does not happen only between individuals, but also between nations, ideologies, and mass movements. Human groups can project their destructive impulses onto outside enemies, and in doing so, justify persecution, fanaticism, and violence. The other side begins to carry everything that we refuse to admit in ourselves. At that point, the conflict stops being merely psychological and becomes historical. The enemy is no longer seen as human and conflicted, but as the pure embodiment of threat. Jung lived in a time marked by wars, totalitarianism, and moral collapse. And his concern with collective projection also grew out of that experience. When crowds externalize their shadow, barbarism finds moral language to justify itself. But Jung does not offer this analysis to make us cynical. He offers it to make us more aware. Recognizing projection does not mean concluding that every judgment is invalid or that objective evil does not exist. It simply means that moral perception must pass through self-criticism. Before turning another person into an absolute enemy, we need to ask, why does this affect me so strongly? What is it in this person that triggers such a loaded reaction? What part of me is being touched here? Questions like these do not weaken ethical awareness. On the contrary, they make it less arrogant and less blind. In Jungian language, withdrawing projections is a work of inner honesty. So projecting evil onto others is a failed attempt at moral cleansing, because it pushes outward what should be understood inwardly. It offers relief, but weakens truth. The world becomes simpler, but the soul becomes more divided. And Jung forces us to face this seriously. As long as we need the other person to carry all the darkness, we will remain far from real self-knowledge. The first step towards seeing the world more justly may be learning to bear the idea that the face we fear most outside may, in part, be waiting to be recognized within us. Within us. Behind the conscious choices, opinions, and identity each person builds over a lifetime, Jung believed there is a psychic layer much older than individual biography. This is not just about forgotten personal memories or repressed desires, but about a shared impersonal ground inherited by humanity itself. That is what he calls the collective unconscious. In the archetypes and the collective unconscious, Jung distinguishes this dimension from the personal unconscious, while the personal unconscious comes from each individual's lived experience. The collective unconscious is made up of universal forms, primitive psychic structures that appear again and again in myths, dreams, religions, fantasies, and symbols across very different cultures. Jung defines it as a layer of the psyche that does not owe its existence to personal experience. This idea is fascinating, but also deeply unsettling. Because if Jung is right, then human beings carry inside themselves not only private memories, but also ancient, impersonal, and sometimes dark forces that they never consciously chose to have. The collective unconscious is not some innocent storage place of beautiful images. It contains archetypes, and some of those archetypes touch primitive, violent, chaotic, and frightening contents. In Jung, the idea of an archetype does not mean a ready-made and fixed image, but a universal tendency toward symbolic formation, a pattern that shapes fundamental human experiences. That helps explain why certain figures return throughout history. The Great Mother, the hero, the wise old man, the shadow, the trickster, the apocalypse, the monster. These forms do not belong to only one culture. They seem to rise from the shared depths of humanity. The darker side of this theory appears when we realize that archetypes are not just abstract ideas. They come charged with psychic energy. Jung often compares them to instinctive patterns, as if they were deep molds that shape emotions, fantasies, and behavior. That means that in certain moments, a person is not just dealing with a passing feeling, but with something much older and more powerful than themselves. Fear can take on mythical proportions. Anger can feel impersonal, almost ritualistic. A dream may bring images of blood, persecution, abysses, demonic figures, or cosmic collapse, even when there is no direct cause in conscious life that seems large enough to explain it. For Jung, these phenomena show that the human psyche is not only rational and modern, it is still crossed by ancient contents. That is exactly why the collective unconscious can be so disturbing. It weakens the comforting image of the human being as a fully civilized subject. Culture, education, and morality may discipline consciousness, but they do not erase the primitive ground of the soul. In times of crisis, fear, war, or social breakdown, that deeper layer can rise with tremendous force. Jung lived through the trauma of the 20th century and saw up close how whole masses of people could be swept away by images of salvation, purity, destruction, and absolute enemies. His theory does not come only from abstract speculation. It also tries to explain why entire peoples, supposedly rational, can fall back into brutal forms of fanaticism. When archetypal forces take hold of collective life, the individual no longer thinks only for themselves, but begins to be driven by symbols too powerful for ordinary consciousness. At this point, Jung touches on an old philosophical problem. Human beings are less in control of themselves than they imagine. Plato already spoke of the inner tensions of the soul. The Greek tragedians showed characters dragged along by destinies and passions greater than their own will. Nietzsche exposed the illusion of a sovereign consciousness. Jung gathers something from all of those insights and gives them a psychological language of his own. The collective unconscious would be proof that reason does not stand at the absolute center of inner life. There is something in us older than our convictions, deeper than our justifications, and sometimes more terrifying than our morality would like to admit. That does not mean abandoning reason. It means recognizing that reason loves surrounded by forces it did not create. Dreams are one of the places where these disturbing forces become most visible. For Jung, the dream is not just the leftover of the day or a disguised wish fulfillment. It can be a symbolic language of the unconscious. And when collective contents rise to the surface, dreams can take on an almost mythical atmosphere. Ruined cities, giant serpents, dark oceans, rituals, wounded gods, threatened children, shadowy figures chasing the dreamer. The intensity of these images does not always match the events of waking life. That is exactly why Jung took them seriously. They would suggest that the psyche sometimes speaks through universal symbols that carry fear, violence, death, transformation, and rebirth. In this view, the frightening is not some accidental deviation. It is part of humanity's symbolic inheritance. But it would be a mistake to imagine that Jung saw these forces only as something to fear. The problem is not that the collective unconscious exists. The problem is being possessed by it without awareness. When archetypal contents emerge and the ego cannot relate to them clearly, a person can be overtaken by fantasies of greatness, paranoia, persecution, or destruction. But when these same contents are recognized symbolically, they can deepen one's understanding of both the self and the human condition. The challenge is balance, not to deny these images, and not to obey them blindly, but to endure their presence without being swallowed by them. Jung saw this as one of the central tasks of psychological maturity. Maybe that is why the theory of the collective unconscious remains so powerful. It destroys the fantasy that we are made only of personal experiences and conscious choices. Jung forces us to face the possibility that in every human being there is a psychic inheritance, older than the individual, a memory without personal recollection, a symbolic theater populated by ancient figures, some luminous, some violent, and some simply terrifying. And in this view, maturity does not mean pretending these forces do not exist. It means recognizing that outer civilization has never fully erased the inner night of the human species. Psychological danger does not always appear as a raw impulse that is easy to recognize. Sometimes it takes on a more seductive form. It shows up as an inner image filled with force, fascination, and authority, as if something ancient inside the person had started to direct the way they feel, think, and act. This is where Jung's language about archetypes takes on a darker tone. For him, archetypes are universal forms of the psyche, connected to the collective unconscious, that express themselves through images, behavior patterns, and recurring symbols. Jung describes them as universal and impersonal structures, almost like instinctive patterns, that shape human experience even before it becomes fully conscious. The problem begins when these forms, instead of being recognized and integrated, quietly start to dominate consciousness. An archetype, by itself, is not evil in the simplest moral sense. What makes it destructive is poor integration, meaning that it emerges with great intensity, while the ego lacks the ability to understand it and place it in context. In those cases, the person no longer relates to the archetypal image. They begin to be possessed by it. Jung and later interpreters in analytical psychology connect this danger to the imbalance between ego and unconscious. When unconscious material is too strong and does not find symbolic expression, it tends to invade psychic life in the form of compulsion, fear, grandiosity, or inner submission. Among these archetypes, some become especially disturbing because they touch directly on chaos, violence, and domination. The shadow is the best known example, since it gathers what consciousness rejects in itself. But it does not act alone. The trickster, for example, can appear as cleverness without responsibility, or as pleasure in creating disorder, manipulating, or humiliating. The mother figure, when distorted, may stop symbolizing protection and start to mean suffocation, possession, and psychic devouring. The father, when poorly integrated, can turn into inner tyranny, rigid law, a voice of condemnation, or an unforgiving demand for control. The hero, who in a healthy form encourages courage and growth, can degenerate into a mission complex, narcissism, and the need to win at any cost. In all of these cases, the archetype stops guiding and starts capturing the personality. This helps explain why some people seem to act as if they are trapped in an inner role they cannot leave behind. Some live in a constant state of battle, as if the whole world required heroism from them. Others organize their lives around fear, as if some invisible catastrophe were always about to happen. Some need to control everything, everyone, and every situation, as if giving up even a little control would mean disappearing. Jung would say that in these cases, we are not just seeing ordinary personality traits, but possible archetypal patterns taking over psychic life. He even suggested that reactions far greater than the immediate situation calls for should be examined closely, because they may be conditioned by an archetype. That point is crucial. The excess may be a sign that something older and deeper has stepped onto the stage. The destructive force of these poorly integrated archetypes lies exactly in the fact that they seem larger than the individual. When a person is overtaken by an archetype of domination, they may feel that their need to control is natural, justified, or unavoidable. When they are captured by an archetype tied to fear, they begin to see threat in everything. When they are under the weight of an inner persecuting figure, they experience reality as if it were a constant trial. The suffering grows because these images are not experienced as passing ideas, but as emotionally charged truths. The person does not just feel, "I am afraid." They feel, "The world is dangerous." They do not just think, "I am angry." They think, "Destruction is necessary." The archetype, then, reorganizes perception itself. Jung's view speaks deeply to philosophy. Plato had already suggested that the human soul can be ruled by forces that escape the control of reason. The Greek tragedians showed characters swept away by passions and destinies greater than their clarity of mind. Nietzsche, centuries later, exposed how consciousness loves to invent noble explanations for underground impulses. Jung gathers these insights and adds something decisive. Part of this dynamic is not only personal, but archetypal. In other words, some inner conflicts do not come only from individual history, but from universal patterns that run through the human species. That makes the experience broader and at the same time more frightening, because the individual realizes they carry something inside themselves that they did not invent, yet still must confront. That is also why Jung never treated the human imagination as just decoration of the mind. Myths, religions, stories, dreams, and symbols were not merely curious cultural products for him. They were expressions of deep psychic structures. When monsters, tyrant kings, devouring mothers, demonic doubles, final wars, or descents into the underworld appear, we are not dealing only with fiction. We are dealing with images that translate real psychic forces. These forces can guide, heal, and expand consciousness, but they can also create destructive fascination when they are lived out literally. Then the person stops interpreting these figures symbolically and starts embodying them or obeying them. That is when the archetype becomes compulsion. There is also a more dangerous side to this. Poorly integrated archetypes do not act only inside the individual. They can spread through entire groups. Jung saw archetypal contents as hidden foundations of the conscious mind and considered the unconscious the larger and more earthy part of the psyche. In times of collective crisis, these images can gain social power. Messianic leaders appear. Absolute enemies are created. Stories of purification take hold, and destructive impulses become justified as salvation. Inner chaos then finds a historical form. Fear demands control. Domination dresses itself up as order. Collective compulsion gets confused with destiny. In that setting, the archetype does not just disturb. It helps organize barbarism. Still, Jung did not believe the solution was to eliminate archetypes, which would be impossible. The task is different: to recognize their presence, bear their energy, and give them symbolic form without being possessed by them. That is the difficult work of integration. The shadow has to be seen so it does not turn into sabotage. Inner authority has to be worked through so it does not become tyranny. The power of the hero has to be put in perspective so it does not turn into fanaticism. Fear has to be listened to so it does not become a prison. In Jungian terms, maturity does not mean living without powerful inner images. It means no longer being their blind instrument in the end. The lesson is hard because it takes away the human fantasy of inner neutrality. We are not made only of rational decisions and clear intentions. There are ancient, universal, intense forms within us, and some of them carry chaos, domination, and destruction. When integrated, they can expand consciousness. When neglected, they can take over the personality. And maybe Jung's most serious point is exactly this. The danger does not begin when the archetype appears, but when it finds a soul unprepared to recognize that certain inner figures, if not understood, eventually start choosing for us. There is a quiet difference between who someone is and who they needs to appear to be. Jung called this social face the persona, bringing back the old meaning of the word, the mask worn by an actor to play a role. In psychological terms, it is the set of attitudes, ways of speaking, postures, and identities that allow a person to move through the world, make a certain impression, and adapt to the expectations around them. Jung defines it as a kind of mask, a system that mediates between individual consciousness and society, built both to create an effect on others and to hide the more intimate nature of the person. The problem is not having a persona. Social life requires one. The danger begins when the mask stops being a tool and starts being confused with the soul itself, not at first glance. The persona seems like a sign of maturity. It helps an impulsive child become polite, an insecure professional hold a role together, and a scattered person take on responsibilities. Jung did not see this as simple falseness, but as a necessity of civilization. Society depends, to a great extent, on this layer of adaptation. No one lives all the time exposing everything they feel, want, or fear. There is a kind of practical wisdom in the mask. It protects, organizes, and filters. The problem is that this social usefulness creates a dangerous illusion, the idea that a well-played role reveals the whole person. Jung insists that it does not. The persona is collective, shaped by outside expectations, cultural codes, and social functions. For that reason, it never fully matches deep individuality. That is exactly where the fragility of the persona appears. The more a person invests in the image they need to maintain, the greater the distance may become between the visible surface and the real conflicts underneath it. The person admired for being calm may be deeply eaten up by anger. The morally flawless figure may hide envy, resentment, or a desire to dominate. The strong person may be inwardly dependent on the approval of others. The mask works, but it comes at a cost. Everything that does not fit into it tends to be pushed into less visible regions of the psyche. Jung puts this sharply when he says that the persona is only a mask of the collective psyche, while real individuality is not exhausted by that identification. In other words, when someone identifies too strongly with their social role, they begin to lose contact with what is alive, contradictory, and unique in them. This idea becomes darker when we think about the kind of conflict the persona usually hides. It does not cover only innocent vulnerability, but also dangerous tensions. Under politeness, there may be hostility and contempt. Under competence, panic about failure. Under moral purity, impulses that consciousness itself considers unacceptable. The social mask does not eliminate these contents. It only makes them harder to recognize. And what is not recognized does not disappear. Jung connects this directly to the theme of the shadow. Everything the ego cannot admit about itself tends to remain active in the unconscious part of the personality. So the fragile persona is not just a shallow appearance. It can be the polished lid placed over an unstable inner ground. There is a deep irony here. The more flawless the social identity seems, the more vulnerable it may be to cracks. That is because the persona, no matter how effective it is, requires constant energy to maintain. A small failure, a public humiliation, a rejection, an emotional crisis, or a professional collapse can shake the carefully built image and bring to the surface contents that had been tightly compressed. The person who kept saying, "That is not who I am," suddenly finds themselves overtaken by reactions they cannot explain. Jung saw this identification of the ego with the mask as dangerous, precisely because it weakens self-awareness and reduces the ability to bear inner contradictions. Consciousness becomes elegant on the outside, but brittle on the inside. This point has enormous philosophical depth. Since antiquity, many thinkers have distrusted overly polished social identities. Socrates unsettled the secure images people had of themselves. The Stoics distinguished between outer reputation and the inner government of the soul. Nietzsche exposed morality as a stage where less noble impulses often hide. Jung stands in this tradition, but with a more precise psychological language. The mask may be necessary, but it becomes dangerous when the self starts existing only inside it. What should be mediation becomes a prison. What should be a function becomes a destiny. And the result is not civilized authenticity, but refined alienation. That is also why the persona is so attractive. It offers something the psyche strongly desires: form, recognition, and belonging. To be the competent one, the wise one, the just one, the strong one, the balanced person gives the ego an organized story about itself. But every identity story leaves leftovers outside it, and those leftovers can pile up as silent suffering. The person who can only exist as efficient loses contact with exhaustion. The one who needs to be admired does not know how to handle ordinary human mediocrity. The one who identifies with goodness rejects the aggression sometimes needed for self-protection. So the persona is fragile, not only because it can fall apart, but because it depends on ongoing exclusions. It holds itself together by leaving whole parts of human experience without language. Jung does not propose destroying the persona, and that point is essential. Without it, stable social life would not be possible. The point is not to tear off the mask and live in total exposure, but to know that it is a mask. When a person recognizes that their professional, moral, or emotional role does not fully define who they are, they gain inner freedom. They can continue to fulfill functions without worshiping them. They can play roles without sacrificing their whole psychic life to them. Integration requires consciousness to endure the idea that there is more inside than the socially approved image. That recognition does not weaken personality. On the contrary, it makes it less theatrical and less vulnerable to sudden collapse. The persona is fragile because it is made for the outer gaze, while the deepest conflicts are born in the inner space. It organizes appearance, but it does not automatically solve the drama within. And that is why Jung still feels so current. He reminds us that a well-built social identity can exist side by side with a disorganized, painful, and even dangerous psychic life. A face admired by the world may be hiding a silent war. The mask may be beautiful, functional, and even necessary, but it is still a mask. And the sooner someone realizes that, the smaller the chance of handing over their inner truth to a role that was never able to carry it completely. There are moments when the mind stops feeling like a livable house and starts becoming unstable ground. What used to be recognized as thought, choice, and identity begins to be invaded by images, impulses, fears, and contents that the person can no longer organize clearly. Jung took this kind of experience very seriously. For him, the ego is the center of consciousness, the part that gives us a sense of continuity, of I, of orientation in the world. But this center is not sovereign or absolute. It exists in relation to a much larger psychic life, the unconscious, and when that relationship loses its balance, the person can be overwhelmed by intense inner disorder. In texts gathered in 2 essays on analytical psychology, Jung deals directly with the relations between the ego and the unconscious, showing that consciousness can suffer the effects of unconscious contents that go beyond it. This idea is central because it corrects a very common illusion, the idea that consciousness fully controls psychic life. Jung thought the opposite. The ego is important, but it is only one part of the total personality. Jungian thought often explains this by saying that the ego tends to keep conscious and unconscious contents separated in order to avoid conflict. But when that separation becomes too extreme, it produces stagnation and tension. In other words, inner balance does not depend on the ego ruling everything, but on its ability to relate to the unconscious without being crushed by it. When that fails, a person may feel taken over by something they do not understand. Unnamed emotions, intense images, ancient fears, fixed ideas, a feeling of losing inner reality. Jung did not see this as some minor detail, but as a real danger in psychic life. The most disturbing part is that this break does not always begin in a dramatic way. Sometimes it announces itself through small cracks, a recurring dream that causes inner confusion, a fantasy that grows too strong, a strange feeling toward oneself, constant irritation with no clear reason, a sense of living on the outside while sinking on the inside. Little by little, the ego stops working as a mediator and starts reacting in a fragile or inflated way. In some cases, it tries to resist with rigidity, clinging to artificial certainties. In others, it loses the ability to filter what is rising from the unconscious. Jung paid close attention to this danger because he saw the psyche as dynamic. When the tension between opposites builds up too much, something has to happen. If there is no symbolic working through, the result can be confusion. This is where symbolic delusions and inner collapse come in. Jung does not reduce every psychic crisis to the same pattern. But he does recognize that when the ego is flooded by unconscious material, a person may begin to experience images and meanings with overwhelming intensity. A dream stops being just a dream and starts spilling into waking life. An ordinary coincidence takes on the feeling of an absolute revelation. A private fear turns into cosmic certainty. The symbol, which should serve as a bridge between consciousness and the unconscious, is no longer interpreted and begins to be taken literally. The person no longer relates to the image. They are captured by it. This is one of the most delicate forms of rupture. Consciousness loses critical distance and begins to live under the control of contents that should be symbolized, not obeyed. Jung's work on religion and psychology keeps stressing that the unconscious can enrich personality, but that requires integration, not submission. This view brings Jung close to a deep philosophical insight. Human beings are not transparent to themselves. Since the Greeks, wisdom has begun with the suspicion that the soul is broader and more divided than pride wants to admit. Plato spoke of inner tensions that challenge the rule of reason. The tragedians showed characters carried away by forces larger than their own clarity. Nietzsche exposed how consciousness invents noble explanations for underground impulses. Jung inherits that whole horizon and translates it into psychological language. The ego does not fail only because of moral weakness, but because it faces an inner dimension greater than itself in both reach and intensity. Jungian thought describes the self, this larger totality, as something that goes beyond the ego in scope and force. That is also why Jung did not defend a reckless plunge into the unconscious. This is a crucial point. Some people imagine that psychological depth means abandoning reason and surrendering to everything that rises from within. For Jung, that would be dangerous. The unconscious is not only a source of creativity and revelation, it also carries ancient, ambiguous, and potentially disorganizing contents. In analytical psychology, the goal is the integration of the parts of the mind. In other words, the aim is not to dissolve the ego, but to strengthen its ability to enter into dialogue with what comes up from the deeper layers of the psyche. The ego must yield to the truth of the unconscious, but it must not disappear into it. Without that balance, what could expand the personality ends up contributing to its fragmentation. This helps explain why certain crises feel so devastating. The suffering does not come only from what emerges, but from the fact that conscious structure and no longer give form to what is being felt. The person loses their inner thread. They may continue functioning outwardly, working, talking, smiling, but inwardly they experience a kind of collapse of meaning. Jung knew this kind of shock up close, including in his own life after his break with Freud, when he went through intense inner experiences that would later be worked through in his writings. That is one reason he took dreams, fantasies, visions, and symbols so seriously. He knew that when the psyche is under too much pressure, it begins to speak in a language different from linear reasoning. And if that language finds neither attention nor form, it can turn into torment. In Jung's thought, individuation is far from being a smooth path of personal growth. It does not happen as a peaceful march toward harmony, nor as a simple discovery of hidden talents. It is a demanding process, often painful, in which a person is led to confront everything they would rather avoid in themselves. Instead of confirming the ideal image the ego has created, individuation puts that image into crisis. It forces the person to move beyond the surface of the persona, leave behind comforting certainties, and come into contact with repressed contents, emotional wounds, and morally ambiguous parts of their own personality. That is why Jung did not see this process as some kind of spiritual luxury, but as a serious passage that can first bring disorder before it brings integration. The first shock of individuation is that it begins by tearing down illusions. A person often lives for a long time identified with roles, social functions, virtues they like to display, and stories they have built about themselves. They believe they are what they can easily name: responsible, fair, generous, rational, strong, sensitive, controlled. But as the process deepens, that conscious identity starts to show cracks. A person begins to realize that behind the cultivated image there is another psychic reality, less elegant and far more contradictory. Individuation demands that the person see that they are not only what they wanted to appear to be. And that discovery is rarely pleasant. This is exactly where the confrontation with repressed contents begins. Everything that has been pushed out of consciousness, whether through shame, fear, moral pressure, or the need to adapt, still exists somewhere in the psyche. The problem is that as long as it remains unconscious, it does not stop acting. It simply works in the shadows, influencing choices, reactions, relationships, and impulses. Individuation, then, does not mean inventing a new self. It means allowing this hidden material to come to the surface so it can be recognized. A person begins to notice in themselves traits they once condemned only in others: envy, hostility, the need for power, vanity, resentment, cowardice, dependence, pleasure in controlling. This recognition is humiliating because it breaks the fantasy of innocence that the ego works so hard to protect. But the pain of individuation does not come only from discovering the moral shadow. It also passes through the emotional wounds that shaped the personality. There are old pains that often disguise themselves as traits of character. A person may call caution what was actually born from fear. They may call independence what grew out of a defense against abandonment. They may call self-discipline what is really a way of never feeling good enough. Individuation forces consciousness to revisit these wounded regions. And this hurts because it is not just about understanding intellectually where certain patterns came from. It is about feeling the real weight they had in shaping one's life. The person begins to see that part of who they became was an attempt to survive inwardly. This process becomes even harder because individuation does not confirm any simple division between light and darkness. It shows that the soul is ambiguous. Good and evil do not always appear cleanly separated inside the personality. Very often, what looks like virtue contains a desire for recognition. What looks like care hides a wish to possess. What looks like honesty carries aggression. What looks like humility may hide fear of self-assertion. Jung insists that growing up requires bearing this ambivalence. A person has to give up the dream of being inwardly pure and accept that psychic life is made of mixtures, tensions, and contradictions. This acceptance is painful because it wounds the ego's moral pride, but it is also freeing because it makes consciousness less blind. Another difficult side of individuation is that it does not happen only as an analysis of the past, but as a living transformation in the present. It is not enough to know that the shadow exists, that there are old wounds, or that the personality contains contradictions. The real challenge is to notice how all of that is still acting now. A person may see, for example, that they still react in childish ways to certain rejections, that they still desperately seek approval, that they still repeat destructive relationships, or that they still sabotage themselves when something important starts to go well. Individuation is painful because it does not allow self-knowledge to remain only in the beautiful world of ideas. It demands a confrontation with the concrete repetition of one's own conflicts. That is also why this process can create a feeling of loss. When someone truly begins to individuate, many old identities stop working. The social role is no longer enough. The mask of strength no longer convinces. The need to please starts to feel like a prison. Moral superiority begins to reveal its fragility. And between the fall of the old and the formation of the new, there is an uncomfortable in-between space. A person may feel groundless without a clear definition, as if they are losing who they were without yet knowing who they are becoming. This stage is especially hard because the ego likes firm outlines. While individuation often passes through zones of transition, ambiguity, and inner disorganization, there is also one essential point. Individuation does not mean moving away from suffering, but changing one's relationship to it. Before, pain often came in the form of blind symptoms, unconscious repetition, or conflict projected onto others. During individuation, that pain begins to be seen, named, and endured with greater awareness. But that does not make it light. Very often, it makes it more real. The person can no longer pretend not to know. They can no longer blame only the world, fate, or other people for everything passing through them. They begin to recognize their own part in their psychic life, and that brings a more mature kind of responsibility. But responsibility in this context is not comfort. It is weight. It is clarity. It is the difficult task of realizing that part of one's prison was built from inner materials. Jung understands that this painful confrontation is necessary because, without it, there is no integration, only surface-level adaptation. A person can spend an entire life being functional, admired, and socially well-adjusted without ever touching the deepest core of themselves. Individuation breaks that comfort. It demands an encounter with what was left out: fragility, aggression, neediness, ambition, fear, the wish to destroy, but also vitality, creativity, and strength that were pushed down along with everything that seemed inconvenient. That is why the process is not only dark. It also brings back living parts of the personality. But that recovery does not happen without conflict. Individuation is painful because it asks the human being to stop being only the edited version of themselves. It tears down masks, exposes wounds, reveals contradictions, and forces consciousness to live with what it spent so long trying to push away. It is not a path of spiritual comfort, but of inner truth. And maybe that is exactly why Jung gives it such importance, because only the person who can bear finding in themselves not only light, but also conflict, ambiguity, and shadow, truly begins to become less divided, less illusory, and less controlled by what they never had the courage to face. The hardest moment in self-knowledge is not discovering hidden talents or finding a brighter version of yourself. The hardest moment is realizing, with some real clarity, that the ability to harm, does not belong only to other people. Jung insisted on this with rare seriousness. For him, psychological maturity requires a real encounter with the evil within, meaning one's own capacity for cruelty, envy, selfishness, cowardice, the desire to dominate, and even destruction. In his reflections on the shadow, Jung says that it represents what the person refuses to recognize in themselves. And Jungian thought often sums this up very clearly. The shadow is the part of the personality that does not match the ideal image the ego wants to maintain. This idea is harsh because it attacks a very comforting illusion, the belief that evil can be safely located outside of us. It is easier to imagine that cruelty belongs to violent people, envy belongs to petty people, selfishness belongs to the corrupt, and destruction belongs to monsters. Jung breaks with that comfort. He is not saying that everyone acts in the same way, or that every person is equally wicked. He is saying something more unsettling. The structure of the human psyche includes dark possibilities that consciousness would rather deny. And denial is not the same as resolution. What the individual does not want to see in themselves continues to exist, continues to press, and continues to look for indirect ways to express itself. That is why the encounter with the evil within is not some theoretical luxury. It is a demand of psychic honesty. Jung speaks of this in terms that almost sound like a moral warning. In his work, confronting the shadow is not a light exercise in self-discovery, but a moral problem. And it is moral because it is not enough to understand in theory that you have a dark side. You have to emotionally endure that truth. A person may accept in theory that no one is perfect, while still being unable to recognize, in concrete terms, their own envy of someone else's success, their quiet satisfaction at a rival's failure, their desire to humiliate someone who threatens them, or their pleasure in controlling others under the excuse of protecting them. The evil within rarely appears with clear labels and warning signs. It usually comes mixed with noble justifications, elegant language, and feelings that seem perfectly legitimate. That is exactly what makes it so dangerous. At this point, Jung comes close to a long philosophical tradition. Socrates already distrusted the soul that never examines itself. The Stoics warned that unnoticed passions enslave the spirit. St. Augustine recognized the inner division of the will, able to want the good while at the same time leaning in the opposite direction. Nietzsche exposed how easily morality can hide resentment, envy, and the will to power. Jung enters that conversation in his own way. The evil within is not only a subject for ethics or religion, but a concrete psychic reality. It does not disappear because a person sees themselves as civilized, spiritual, or morally correct. On the contrary, the more flawless the self-image, the harder it may be to recognize the dark zones of personality. That is why this encounter requires courage. Not public, visible, celebrated courage, but a quiet courage, almost humiliating in its honesty. Jung suggests that when someone truly tries to see their shadow, they become aware of, and often feel ashamed of qualities and impulses they deny in themselves, even though they see them clearly in others. Selfishness, moral laziness, ignoble fantasies, manipulative behavior, cowardice, and excessive attachment to possessions and power. This is brutal because it shows that the problem is not found only in great moral falls, but also in the small daily distortions of the soul. The evil within does not live only in extremes. It slips into the pleasure of putting others down, the need to always win, cold indifference, and using other people as instruments. Jung also understood that without this recognition, the individual remains trapped in projection. Instead of admitting their own aggression, they start seeing hostility everywhere. Instead of recognizing their ambition, they accuse others of being hungry for power. Instead of accepting their own ability to hurt, they imagine they are always only reacting to an unjust world. So the encounter with the evil within is the opposite of psychological hypocrisy. It tears down the fantasy of absolute innocence, and that does not weaken ethical awareness. It makes it more serious, because someone who knows what they are capable of tends to be less arrogant in judging others and more watchful in relation to themselves. There is also a decisive point here. Recognizing your own capacity for destruction does not mean obeying it. Jung is not proposing surrender to the worst parts of yourself, and he does not romanticize darkness. The goal of analytic work is to take in the unconscious elements of the psyche and move toward a greater integration of the personality. That means the evil within must be known, so it does not act in an automatic and blind way. The mature person is not the one who no longer has dark impulses, but the one who no longer depends on denial in order to appear good. That person becomes more truthful, and for that very reason, less vulnerable to being possessed by what they have repressed. This view gains even more weight when Jung thinks about collective life. In Civilization in Transition, the moral problem of the modern age appears connected to the need for new foundations of goodness and justice. Precisely because evil can no longer be treated as something simple and external. When individuals and groups refuse to face their own dark side, they become more likely to project it onto enemies, minorities, opponents, and strangers. Denied inner evil then returns as outer persecution. Barbarism often begins with a conscience that believes itself too pure. That is why inner work is not only private. It has historical, political, and civilizational consequences. At the center of this lesson is a severe truth. Maturity is not only about learning to cultivate virtues, but about enduring the revelation that the human soul is morally ambiguous. Jung does not offer sentimental comfort. He asks for clarity. He asks the person to stop imagining that they are made only of good intentions and to recognize, without drama and without despair, that they also carry destructive possibilities. Only then does ethics stop being a performance and begin to become responsibility. Because the real danger is not discovering that there is evil within us. The real danger is spending an entire life needing to believe that it exists only in others. It's only in others. The unconscious does not always speak through clear ideas. Very often, it prefers images. That is why Jung took dreams so seriously. Instead of treating them as meaningless mental noise, he saw them as a privileged path into the deeper life of the psyche. In Man and His Symbols, a book written for a wider audience, Jung insists that dreams produce symbols spontaneously and reveal aspects of the mind that consciousness does not easily notice. Jungian thought often sums this up by saying that dreams are the most common and universal source for exploring the human capacity to symbolize, and one of the main paths to knowing the unconscious. This completely changes the way we look at the experience of dreaming. For Jung, the dream is not just a strange theater of imagination, nor a puzzle to be solved through fixed formulas. It is a symbolic message, but not in the simple sense of this always means that. For Jung, a symbol is born precisely when something cannot yet be fully translated into rational language. It points toward a living content, something greater than any immediate explanation. That is why, when someone dreams of being chased, of ruined houses, monstrous figures, abysses, blood, invasions, falls, or disturbing doubles of themselves, the dream may be revealing something that consciousness would rather keep far away: fear, aggression, moral conflict, repressed impulses, or deep tensions that found no expression during the day. This is the most unsettling side of the theory. Dreams often reveal not what a person wants to know about themselves, but what they avoid knowing. Jung broke away from Freud on several important points, and one of the biggest involved the meaning of dreams. He did not see them mainly as disguises for specific impulses, but as compensatory phenomena. In other words, dreams tend to balance what is underrepresented in conscious life. That means that if someone spends the entire day trapped in a self-image of control, virtue, or calm, the dream may show the opposite: chaos, rage, humiliation, desire, cowardice, or violence. Not because the dream is lying, but because it is compensating for the one-sidedness of consciousness. This is where the dark side enters with real force. When Jung speaks of the shadow, he means what the ego rejects or refuses to recognize in itself. Dreams then become one of the most important places where that shadow can appear. Not in a direct or didactic way, but through symbolic figures and situations. An unknown pursuer, a threatening animal, an abandoned child, a murderer, a stranger inside one's own house, a seductive voice leading someone astray, a landscape of destruction. These images should not be read as literal predictions, but as expressions of real psychic contents. Instead of saying directly, "You are angry," the dream shows a scene in which violence is alive. Instead of declaring, "You are afraid of losing control," it creates an atmosphere of disintegration. The unconscious speaks through images, because sometimes the image can reach what the concept still cannot bear. That is what makes dreams morally uncomfortable. They can show a person that their conscious identity is more fragile than it appears. Someone who sees themselves as entirely kind dreams of cruelty. Someone who thinks of themselves as rational is overwhelmed by ancient and terrifying symbols. Someone who believes they are invulnerable encounters scenes of helplessness and collapse at night. Jung took this seriously because he understood that the psyche is larger than the ego. In analytical psychology, the unconscious includes both the personal and the collective dimension, which is why some dreams do not express only immediate personal conflicts, but also universal, archetypal images filled with fear, death, transformation, and threat. This view brings Jung close to a deep philosophical tradition. The Greeks already suspected that the human soul is not fully at one with itself. Ancient tragedies filled with dreams, omens, and visions that reveal what daylight clarity cannot contain. Nietzsche also showed that conscious surface is too thin to carry the whole truth about human beings. Jung translates that into psychological language. The dream is not a failure of reason, but a symbolic correction of reason's arrogance. It reminds the ego that there is a psychic ground more ancient, more ambivalent, and more troubling than any comforting story it tells about itself. But Jung did not see dark dreams only as a threat. That point is essential. The fact that a dream reveals fear, destruction, or dark impulses does not mean it is condemning the person, much less that those contents should be obeyed. The value of the dream lies in making visible what, during waking life, had been acting in the dark. When the image is recognized as a symbol, it can expand consciousness. The real danger is not dreaming of darkness, but completely ignoring what those images are trying to show. Then the conflict keeps acting without form, without reflection, and without language. That is also why Jung insisted that dream interpretation requires care. There is no universal dictionary that can solve a dream's meaning in a mechanical way. The same symbol can take on very different meanings depending on the dreamer's life, emotional context, and the web of images inside the dream itself. Even so, one rule remains important. When an image returns with force, especially during times of crisis, transition, or confusion, it deserves attention. The most powerful dreams, marked by a strong symbolic atmosphere, may be signs that the psyche is trying to compensate for a consciousness that has become too one-sided, or warn about something that has been repressed for too long. At the deepest level, dreams hold a central place in Jung's thought because they break the monopoly of the story we tell about ourselves. During the day, we choose our words, attitudes, and justifications. At night, the soul may speak in another way, and it does not always bring comfort. Sometimes it brings monsters, ruins, chases, and scenes of losing control. But that is exactly where its power lies. The dream reveals that the dark side is not a literary invention or a philosophical exaggeration. It is a real possibility within psychic life, one that asks for symbolic recognition before it turns into unconscious destiny. There are inner forces that do not appear right away as open violence, but as distortions of emotion, perception, and our connection with other people. Jung saw something like this in the figures of the anima and the animus. In his classic formulation, the anima refers to the unconscious feminine dimension in a man, and the animus to the unconscious masculine dimension in a woman. In IN, he treats both as archetypes connected to the collective unconscious and to the projections that arise from them. Today, many people read this language more broadly and less strictly through gender, but within Jung's system, the main point remains the same. There are inner images that mediate the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious, and when they appear in negative form, they can distort how we love, think, and interpret reality. The darker side of these figures begins precisely when they stop functioning as a bridge and start acting like a distorting filter. Instead of expanding the personality, they become forces that take over perception. Jung describes how difficult it is to dissolve the projections of the anima and the animus because they are not just personal habits. They are rooted in deeper structures of the psyche. That means the person is not dealing only with a passing opinion or emotion, but with an inner image filled with energy, capable of imposing itself on consciousness. When that happens, the other person is no longer seen as they really are. They are turned into a screen for fantasies, demands, and fears that belong to the inner world of the one perceiving them. In its negative form, the anima can appear as an emotional atmosphere that pulls a person into states of wounded sensitivity, jealousy, dramatization, emotional dependence, deceptive seduction, or paralyzing melancholy. Instead of encouraging depth of feeling, it creates confused fascination. The individual no longer loves the other person as a real person, but as the container of an idealized, feared, or desired image. In one of Jung's well-known formulations from IN, he connects the anima with moods, meaning emotional states that can take over consciousness when they are not recognized. The problem is not feeling deeply, but being ruled by emotions that rise from within as if they were absolute truth, and that, because of that, sabotage clarity in relationships. The negative animus, on the other hand, tends to appear less as emotional flooding and more as mental hardening. Jung associated it with opinions, and interpreters of his work often describe this lower form as a kind of impoverished logos, rigid judgments, ready-made formulas, certainties that impose themselves without truly listening to the situation or the person involved. Instead of living thought, what appears is a dogmatic inner voice that argues in order to dominate, correct, close the discussion, and win. The person believes they are being rational, when in fact they are being possessed by an inflexible mental structure. Thought stops searching for truth and starts serving the compulsion to be right. That is how the dark animus can feed destructive relationships, not through obvious explosions, but through an inner hardness that dismisses, crushes, or freezes the other person. This helps explain why Jung connected anima and animus to romantic projections. Many passions begin less with a meeting with the real other person and more with being captured by an inner image. A person feels they have found their salvation, their ruin, their lost half, or their intimate enemy, when in fact they are under the effect of an archetypal content being projected outward. The relationship then becomes full of intensity, but loses truth. Jung notes that relationships ruled by anima and animus, whether in positive or negative form, are full of strong emotional charge and often unfold as if the people involved no longer even know what is really moving them. That helps explain why some bonds feel irresistible, even though they quickly become confusing, possessive, or destructive. From a philosophical point of view, This theory touches on a very old problem. Human beings rarely see the other person in a pure way. Plato already distrusted the power of images over the soul. The Stoics warned that disordered passions distort judgment. Nietzsche showed how much consciousness deceives itself about its own motives. Jung adds something decisive. In many relationships, we are not only reacting to the person in front of us, but also to inner figures that are activated in them and through them. That is why human encounters are always more ambiguous than they seem. We love, hate, idealize, and condemn not only because of the real other person, but also because of what they awaken in our unconscious. The greatest danger is that these dark inner images often feel extremely convincing. The negative anima may whisper that without a certain person life loses all meaning, that every frustration is abandonment, that every limit is rejection. The negative animus may declare that it already knows everything, that the other person is wrong before they even speak, that vulnerability is weakness, and that yielding is humiliation. In both cases, psychic life becomes narrower. The person loses inner freedom. They no longer feel or think with openness, but under the control of an inner figure that turns emotion into manipulation and thought into tyranny. The romantic, family, or intellectual relationship becomes contaminated because there is no longer a true meeting. What remains is the acting out of unconscious fantasies. Jung does not propose eliminating anima and animus, as if these figures were simply mistakes of the soul. For him, the challenge is to integrate them. That requires recognizing the projection, taking back from the other person the symbolic weight that was placed on them, and bearing the truth that part of the fascination or rejection comes from within. In Jung, the order of the analytical process itself is meaningful. Before recognizing anima and animus, one must confront the shadow. In other words, without admitting the dark side of the personality, a person will have great difficulty seeing how their relationships are being manipulated by unconscious images. Integration does not destroy emotional depth or reflection. It simply keeps feeling from turning into illusion and thought from turning into rigidity. Few experiences are as unsettling as realizing that, at certain moments, a person acts as if they are not fully in control of themselves. They know what they should say. They know what would be the wiser thing to do. They even know that a certain behavior will lead to regret. And yet they still repeat the same gesture, reaction, outburst, fear, or submission. Jung paid very close attention to this phenomenon and found in complexes one of the most disturbing explanations for this loss of inner control. For him, complexes are not just traumas in the everyday sense, nor are they simple passing emotions. They are psychic centers charged with emotion, organized around experiences, memories, fantasies, and wounds, and they can gain a kind of autonomy within the personality. It is exactly that autonomy that makes the idea so disturbing. A complex is not just any thought that comes and goes through the mind. It works almost like an independent emotional center, capable of interfering with perception, memory, judgment, and behavior. When it is activated, a person stops reacting only to the present and begins responding from an older content, one that is loaded with tension and built up over time. It is as if something inside them takes over the scene. Consciousness is still there, but it is no longer in clear command. The person may even realize, on some level, that they are exaggerating, distorting things, or losing themselves. But that awareness is not enough to regain control. The complex speaks louder. That is why Jung used such strong language when talking about this subject. In certain states, the human being is not just influenced by an unconscious content, but almost possessed by it. And this possession does not need to be understood in a mystical sense. It is psychological. The person becomes taken over by an emotional field so intense that they begin to see everything through it. A small criticism feels like unbearable humiliation. A simple delay feels like abandonment. A minor disagreement becomes an unforgivable offense. Another person's silence is interpreted as contempt. The complex reorganizes reality. It does not just change what the person feels. It changes the world they believe they are seeing. This is the most delicate point in the theory. When someone is under the influence of a complex, they are not reacting only to what is happening now, but to what that event awakens inside them. The present touches something old, and that old layer responds with far more force than the situation itself would deserve. That is why so many human reactions seem out of proportion. It is not only a matter of bad manners, moral weakness, or lack of self-control, even though those things may also be present. In many cases, it is a deep psychic activation. The person is not just irritated, hurt, or afraid. They have been captured by an emotional structure that was already there, waiting for a trigger. Jung noticed this very early when he observed how certain words, memories, or situations could produce slips, blocks, sudden forgetting, and intense emotional shifts. Something that seemed small revealed a sensitive area of the personality. From there, he developed the idea that the human mind is not one perfectly unified whole. There are parts within us that may be only weakly connected to the conscious center. These parts keep their own emotional charge, their own memory, and their own patterns of reaction. In times of balance, they remain more or less quiet. But when provoked, they can impose themselves almost like small inner personalities. This helps explain why being possessed by complexes is so humiliating for the ego. The ego likes to believe that it decides, chooses, and controls. Complexes show that this sovereignty is only partial. There are zones within us that do not easily obey rational will. A person may decide they will not be jealous, but when certain insecurities are triggered, they begin investigating, doubting, imagining, and accusing. Another may promise that they will no longer submit, but in front of an authority figure, they shrink, fall silent, and betray themselves. Another desperately wants to be loved, and because of that, repeats relationships that wound them, as if something inside were always searching for the same kind of suffering. A complex creates repetition. It pulls the person back into the same script, even when they already understand rationally that this script is destroying them. This has an important philosophical side, because it destroys the simple image of the human being as a subject fully transparent to themselves. Jung comes close here to an ancient insight. To know yourself is not only to list your qualities and faults, but to discover that there are forces inside the soul that do not always match what we think we want. Rational will does not rule alone. And that makes inner life far more dramatic. The problem with a complex is not only that it hurts, it is that it reduces freedom. The person begins acting from emotional automatisms. Instead of responding to reality, they respond to their wound. Another dark side of this is that complexes rarely present themselves honestly. They like to disguise themselves as absolute truth. An inferiority complex, for example, does not say, "I am wounded." It says, "No one respects me." A power complex does not say, "I am afraid of losing my value." It says, "I need to control everything." An abandonment complex does not say, "I carry an old lack inside me." It says, "They are leaving me out again." The complex speaks as if it were reality itself. And that is exactly why it is so convincing. When we are under its control, we do not just feel a strong emotion. We feel that our reading of the world is the only possible one. But Jung does not present this theory to condemn a person to helplessness. The fact that complexes exist does not mean we are doomed to be ruled forever by these autonomous inner zones. The first step is recognizing that they exist. As long as someone believes that their reactions are always purely rational and justified, they remain at the mercy of what they do not know. When they start to notice patterns, repetitions, blind spots, and recurring exaggerations, they gain some inner distance. And that distance is already a form of freedom. The complex does not disappear right away, but it stops acting with the same invisibility. Even so, Jung is severe on this point. Real self-knowledge does not mean memorizing beautiful explanations about yourself, but enduring the painful experience of seeing how certain wounds organize your life far more than you would like to admit. The complex shows that the human soul is fragmented, that the unity of the self is fragile, and that there are inner regions capable of ruling us against our own clarity. And maybe that is the most serious part of the whole lesson. The greatest danger is not only having complexes, but spending an entire life believing that our most automatic, repetitive, and destructive reactions are simply the way we are, when in fact they may be signs that, silently, something inside us has been deciding in place of our consciousness for a very long time. We like to think of ourselves as beings guided by logic, calculation, and clarity. It is a comforting image. It makes it seem as if reason stands at the center of human life, and everything outside of it is just deviation, weakness, or ignorance. Jung did not accept such a simple view. For him, reason is important, but it is far from being the only force that moves a human being. Beneath conscious explanations, old impulses, symbolic images, deep fears, contradictory desires, and fascinations that do not always pass through the filter of clear thinking are still at work. In that sense, the human being is not just a rational animal. It is also a being crossed by dark, mythical, and impulsive forces. This idea is uncomfortable because it challenges the vanity of consciousness. Most people prefer to believe that they think first and act afterward. Jung observed that, very often, the opposite happens. First, something touches us, pulls us, bends us, captures us emotionally. Only afterward does the mind organize explanations to make what was already decided at a deeper level look rational. That means reason is not always in command. In many cases, it only explains things afterward, and that reversal is essential for understanding why intelligent, educated, and apparently balanced people can still be carried away by destructive passions, fanatical beliefs, or behaviors clearly opposed to their own good. At the center of this view is the idea that the human psyche is larger than consciousness. The ego, with its opinions, choices, and arguments, represents only one part of inner life. There are much older regions within us, connected to the unconscious, that do not speak the language of formal logic. They express themselves through images, emotions, impulses, dreams, fears, symbols, and attractions that seem impossible to explain. The problem is that modern culture has trained many people to treat as irrational anything that does not immediately fit into clear concepts, as if whatever is obscure must always be some kind of mistake. Jung proposes something more radical. The irrational is not just an accident of the mind. It is part of the human structure itself. That is why myth is still so alive, even in an age of technology and information. Modern consciousness likes to see itself as emancipated, but the human being still responds with enormous intensity to stories of salvation, catastrophe, heroism, persecution, purity, and destruction. It still needs symbols. It is still moved by images that carry more force than many arguments. Just look at how many people become attached to leaders, ideas, groups, or causes with a kind of devotion that goes far beyond rational analysis. In those situations, what is at stake is not only an opinion, but a deep emotional investment. Something mythical has stepped in. The person no longer commits only because they agree. They commit because something in a deeper layer of the soul has been touched. Jung saw this as a permanent feature of the human condition. A person does not stop being primitive just because they live in cities, use sophisticated language, or master complex tools. The surface changes, but the deeper layer remains. Beneath civilization, very old forces are still moving. Fear of chaos, the need to belong, the desire for power, fascination with authority, attraction to violence, hunger for meaning, and the need to turn existence into moral drama. The irrational does not survive only at the edges of culture. It runs through the center of it. It is present in politics, religion, romantic relationships, crowds, modern idolatries, and even in the way a person tells the story of their own life. This is one of the darkest parts of Jung's thought. Human beings are drawn to the irrational, not only because they do not know the truth, but because the irrational offers something reason alone cannot always provide: intensity, belonging, enchantment, identity, and emotional direction. Logic can explain, but it does not always comfort. An argument can convince, but it does not always move us. Symbols, myths, and passion speak to deeper regions of the psyche. They organize fear, give shape to desire, turn suffering into story, and offer the soul a kind of total language. The problem is that this force can both enrich and destroy. Because in Jung, the irrational is not only a source of creativity and depth, it is also the doorway to fanaticism, collective delusion, compulsion, and self-deception. When consciousness loses the ability to reflect critically on what is moving it, the individual begins to be governed by emotions and images that feel larger than the self. The person then no longer thinks only, "This makes sense." They feel, "This possesses me." And when that happens, reason tends to become a servant. Instead of examining things freely, it works to justify the impulse. The person builds arguments to defend what they already wanted emotionally. Reasoning becomes the lawyer of passion. This helps explain why so much human behavior is contradictory. A person may be rational at work and completely irrational in love. They may defend clarity in public and act with private superstition when fear appears. They may criticize the fanaticism of others, while at the same time surrendering blindly to stories that feed their own identity. Jung did not see this as simple moral hypocrisy, though sometimes it is that too. He saw it as a divided psychic structure. The human being wants to be guided by reason, but also wants to be swept away. Wants order, but also dizziness. Wants clarity, but feels drawn to anything that promises depth, mystery, and absolutes. This ambivalence has a very serious philosophical dimension. Since antiquity, many thinkers have doubted the full sovereignty of reason. The Greek tragedians showed characters carried away by forces greater than their own clarity. Plato feared the impulses that throw the soul into disorder. Nietzsche exposed the false purity of rational consciousness. Jung gathers something from all of this and gives it a forceful psychological form. Human life is not moved only by conscious decisions, but also by dark layers that reason neither creates nor fully controls. That does not mean reason should be dismissed. It means it must be placed in its true position, necessary, but not enough. The decisive point is that Jung does not propose surrendering to the irrational. He is not saying that we should blindly obey impulses, myths, or inner fascination. What he proposes is harder than that: to recognize that these forces exist and learn how to deal with them without denying them or worshiping them. Because denying the irrational does not eliminate it. It only pushes it into blinder forms. And worshiping it would mean giving up every standard. Maturity requires something else: noticing when the soul is being pulled by images and impulses that feel too grand, too inevitable, or too sacred. On their own, human beings already struggle to recognize their own dark side. In a group, that struggle can become even more dangerous. Jung clearly understood that a crowd is not just the sum of several individuals gathered together, but a psychological phenomenon of its own, capable of deeply changing how people feel, judge, and act. In collective movements, crowds, and communities inflamed by the same emotion, the individual can lose part of their moral awareness and become a vehicle for impulses that, alone, they might still repress. In that sense, the crowd does not create the shadow out of nothing. It amplifies it. It offers a stage, a justification, and the energy for repressed contents to find a collective form of expression. This is one of the most disturbing ideas in Jung's thought, because it breaks the belief that personal morality remains untouched once we enter a group. Very often, the opposite happens. What a person can still hold back when alone begins to dissolve when they feel protected by unanimity, collective emotion, and the sense of belonging. Instead of asking, "Is this just?" they begin, often without even noticing it, to ask, "Is this what the group expects from me?" Moral judgment is slowly replaced by emotional contagion. Responsibility weakens. Violence, once restrained, finds a new language. It no longer looks like cruelty, but begins to appear as duty, defense, courage, or purification. Jung understood that this happens because the crowd weakens conscious individuality. When absorbed into a strongly mobilized collective, a person tends to think less for themselves and feel more through identification. The personal soul gives way to the group soul, and this group soul is especially vulnerable to the eruption of the shadow because the group offers a seductive advantage. It spreads out the guilt. When everyone is shouting, the individual voice matters less. When everyone hates, hatred feels justified. When everyone attacks, violence starts to look normal. The crowd creates a kind of moral anonymity, and inside that anonymity, repressed impulses can rise much more easily. That is why Jung viewed collective formations with so much ambivalence. He did not deny that communities, traditions, and social bonds can support human life. The problem begins when the collective stops being a space of coexistence and becomes a field of emotional possession. At that point, the group does not raise consciousness. It lowers it. The person no longer feels like a responsible self standing among other selves, but like part of something bigger, stronger, more exciting, and apparently more legitimate than their own reflection. And there's a powerful seduction in that. The crowd relieves the burden of doubt, guilt, and moral ambiguity. Alone, the individual hesitates. In the crowd, they find permission to act without so much inner struggle. This permission becomes especially dangerous when the group organizes itself around an enemy. The collective shadow almost always needs a target. What the group cannot bear to recognize in itself gets projected outward, onto the opponent, the outsider, the dissenter, the different one, the heretic, the traitor. Everything dark, aggressive, chaotic, or threatening is placed onto the other. From that point on, violence seems not only acceptable, but necessary. The enemy is no longer seen as human and morally mixed, but as the embodiment of everything that must be eliminated. This is one of the darkest mechanisms of collective life. The group throws out the evil living within itself, and then hunts it as if it existed entirely outside. Jung lived through a century that gave him tragic examples of this. He saw how educated, organized, and apparently civilized societies could be swept away by mass movements filled with fanaticism, moral delusion, and justified violence. This reinforced his conviction that human beings are not guided only by reason and progress, but also by ancient forces that emerge with great intensity in collective settings. The crowd awakens what is primitive. It activates old fears, symbols of purity and contamination, fantasies of salvation, images of decay, and visions of destruction. When these contents are stirred up, the group no longer moves only through arguments. It begins moving through emotional myths. And that is exactly where the shadow finds fertile ground. Because the individual shadow already contains aggression, resentment, envy, the will to dominate, and pleasure in destruction. When those energies connect with a collective cause, they gain something that makes them even more dangerous: moral justification. The person no longer feels that they are simply hurting, humiliating, or hating. They feel that they are protecting values, defending their own, fighting for justice, or fulfilling a mission. Violence stops looking like violence. It becomes duty. And that transformation is deeply frightening, because it allows ordinary people to take part in cruelty without seeing themselves as cruel. The crowd also amplifies the shadow because it weakens nuanced thinking. In an inflamed group, the complex replaces reflection, the slogan replaces analysis, and emotion replaces awareness. Everything tends to become simpler, more extreme, and more absolute. You are either fully inside or fully outside. You either love or hate. You are either pure or a threat. Moral life, which is naturally difficult and full of ambiguity, is reduced to brutal categories. And the more simplified reality becomes, the freer the shadow becomes to act. It loves total certainty, clear enemies, and grand justifications. But Jung did not treat this as only a political or historical problem. It was, before anything else, a psychological one. The crowd becomes dangerous because it finds in each individual an existing tendency. The temptation to give up personal consciousness in exchange for belonging, strength, and inner relief. The group offers a kind of moral intoxication. And that intoxication is attractive because it frees the person from the responsibility of examining themselves. As long as they are participating in the collective energy, they do not need to ask what they are projecting, what they are repressing, or how much of their own aggression has been unleashed under the excuse of loyalty to the group. This means that the true antidote to the collective shadow is not only to denounce the violence of others, but to strengthen individual consciousness. Jung believed that without individuation, without self-knowledge, and without a real confrontation with one's own shadow, the person remains vulnerable to collective possession. Anyone who does not recognize their own capacity for hatred can easily be captured by movements that promise to hate in their place. Anyone who does not admit their own desire for destruction feels innocent, while supporting destruction considered noble. The crowd is dangerous precisely because it welcomes what the individual has not worked through within themselves. Jung leaves us with a severe warning. Collective barbarism does not arise only from exceptional monsters, but from the sum of consciences that gave themselves up. When the individual psychologically disappears inside the group, the shadow finds room to grow without restraint. And maybe the most uncomfortable part of this lesson is this: mass violence is not fed only by wrong ideas, but also by the secret pleasure of finally being allowed, with collective approval, to release everything that isolated consciousness was still trying to hide. For Jung, religion was not just a set of outside beliefs, nor only a historical institution created to organize societies. It also served deep psychological function. In many cases, religious symbols act as ways of containing, representing, and giving some kind of meaning to inner forces that, if they appeared in a raw form, could throw the personality into disorder. Instead of seeing the sacred symbol as just decoration for faith, Jung treated it as a language capable of reaching very old regions of the soul, where fear, desire, guilt, hope, violence, and the need for meaning all exist together. In this view, religion does not remove psychic chaos. It tries to give it form. This is a powerful idea because it starts from a truth that is not very comfortable. Human inner life is not made only of clear thoughts and balanced emotions. Inside us there are contradictory impulses, disturbing images, deep moral tensions, and experiences that reason alone cannot always organize. Jung believed that the unconscious not only stores repressed material, but also compensates for the excesses of consciousness and produces symbols to express what cannot be said directly. When consciousness becomes too one-sided, too rigid, or too poor to hold the full complexity of the psyche, the unconscious begins to press back. And one of the oldest ways human beings have responded to that pressure has been through the creation of religious images, rituals, and stories. That is why religious symbols appear with such force in times of crisis. They are not just decorative doctrines. They work like frames for what cannot easily be said. Sign, judgment, sacrifice, redemption, the desert, the fall, purification, resurrection, the apocalypse, all of these can be read in a Jungian way as attempts to organize extreme inner experiences. The symbol allows the soul to bear what would otherwise be too much if it appeared without mediation. Instead of raw and nameless fear, a story appears. Instead of a vague and maddening guilt, a ritual appears. Instead of chaotic inner violence, a powerful image appears that both represents it and places limits on it. The symbol does not magically solve the conflict, but it keeps it from remaining completely shapeless. At this point, Jung's reading of religion becomes especially dark and interesting. He does not see the sacred only as a vehicle of goodness, order, and comfort. He sees that religious symbols themselves often try to deal with contents that are ambiguous, destructive, and even frightening. In other words, religion does not speak only about light. It also speaks about what threatens, wounds, judges, punishes, destroys, and unsettles. This becomes especially clear when Jung turns to biblical figures and to the problem of the relationship between the human and the divine. The religious universe then stops being a showcase of ideal purity and also becomes a mirror of humanity's own moral and psychological tension. This helps explain why certain rituals have such strong emotional impact. A ritual is not just formal repetition. For Jung, it can be a symbolic dramatization of deep inner processes. Liturgy, for example, gives structure, sequence, limits, and meaning to what in the soul might otherwise be experienced as scattered confusion. Suffering stops being only suffering and enters into a symbolic drama. Transformation stops being pure chaos and becomes represented through shared images. This matters psychologically because the human psyche can better endure what it is able to symbolize. When there is no symbol, the content may invade consciousness in a much rawer way. That is also why Jung took the appearance of religious images in extreme psychological states so seriously. When the limits of consciousness weaken, archetypal contents can emerge with enormous intensity, and they often take religious or mythological forms. This suggests that the sacred symbol is not just some random cultural detail, but one of the preferred languages of the psyche for expressing deep and collective contents. There is, then, a close connection between religion and containment. What in a state of disorder might appear as chaotic invasion can, within a symbolic tradition, be received, named, and partly worked through. The symbol acts like a vessel. It receives the excess and tries to keep it from spreading without form. From a philosophical point of view, this brings Jung close to an old insight. Human beings need symbolic mediations so they are not crushed by what is excessive in their own condition. Greek tragedy, myths, rituals, and religions have always served, among other things, to give shape to terror, guilt, desire, and fate. Jung translates that insight into psychology. The soul does not live by concepts alone. It needs images that can unite opposites, that can build a bridge between consciousness and the unconscious, between suffering and meaning, between threat and transformation. When that mediation fails, the person may be left exposed to a chaos that no longer has an adequate language. But Jung does not idealize religion in a naive way. The same symbol that contains can also become rigid. The same ritual that organizes can also become empty repetition. The same image that protects from chaos can also be used to deny real conflicts. That is why the psychological function of religion should not be confused with an automatic guarantee of balance. A symbol helps when it remains alive, when it still speaks to the soul, when it still serves as a bridge between inner experience and consciousness. When it becomes only a dead formula and no longer truly contains anything, it only covers things over. And what is merely covered over will, sooner or later, begin pressing again. For a long time, there was a comforting tendency to treat evil as simply the absence of good, as if it had no real substance of its own and existed only as failure, lack, or deviation. Jung was not satisfied with that view. For him, evil could not be reduced to some abstract shadow of goodness, nor dissolved into reassuring moral formulas. It had to be recognized as a concrete psychic reality. That means something deeply uncomfortable. Evil is not just a philosophical idea, not just a social problem, and not just a religious theme. It acts within the human soul as a living force, with energy, form, and real effects. Ignoring it does not weaken it. Very often, it only makes it more dangerous. This is one of the harshest dimensions of Jung's thought. Human beings prefer to imagine that evil exists outside of them, in obvious monsters, great criminals, tyrants, and historical enemies. That image protects moral self-esteem. But Jung breaks with that comfort. He says that the capacity for destruction, cruelty, selfishness, envy, and violence does not belong only to exceptional figures. It is part of the human psychic condition. And for exactly that reason, evil must be thought of as something real within inner life, not just as the absence of good. If it were only absence, then it would be enough to shine light on it. But for Jung, it is not that simple. Evil has presence. It organizes itself, persists, seduces, distorts, and expresses itself. This view completely changes the way morality is understood. Instead of thinking of ethics as a clean separation between the good and the bad, Jung forces us to recognize that the human soul is inwardly ambiguous. A person carries not only noble intentions and developing virtues, but also dark impulses that cannot be erased by idealism. In that sense, evil is not some side accident of the psyche. It belongs to the dramatic structure of personality itself. It appears in the will to dominate, in the pleasure of putting others down, in the desire for revenge, in indifference to the suffering of others, in secret satisfaction at a rival's fall, and in the seduction of destruction. These forms may sometimes be subtle and sometimes brutal, but all of them suggest that evil has real psychological weight. That is why Jung distrusted simplified moral explanations. When people say too quickly that human beings are essentially good and that evil is only error, ignorance, or disorder, they lose contact with an uncomfortable truth. There are situations in which a person wants to hurt, wants to humiliate, wants to destroy, and may even take pleasure in it. That does not mean that this desire fully defines the person, but it does mean that it exists as a real possibility. Without that recognition, consciousness becomes naive. And for Jung, naive consciousness is always more vulnerable to being overtaken by what it denies. Evil that is not recognized gains freedom precisely because it remains unnamed. At this point, Jung's thought takes on an almost tragic power. He comes close to the ancient wisdom that knew the human being is not morally transparent to itself. Greek tragedy already showed characters driven by destructive impulses that do not fit neatly into a simple division between guilt and innocence. St. Augustine recognized the divided will. Nietzsche exposed how morality could hide resentment and the will to power. Jung enters this tradition with his own psychological language. Evil is a psychic reality because it is not only an object of moral reflection, but an effective energy acting inside us. It does not need to be believed in to operate. It only needs to remain unrecognized. This helps explain why Jung was so concerned about repressing the dark side. When evil is treated only as something external, or only as the absence of good, a person avoids confronting their own part in it. Instead of asking, "What am I capable of?" they ask only, "Who are the bad people?" That shift may seem small, but it has enormous consequences. The first question demands humility and responsibility. The second encourages projection. The individual begins placing all darkness in the other person. And by doing that, they feel morally authorized to fight, exclude, or hate without examining themselves. Evil denied inwardly returns as outward persecution. That is how the psychic reality of evil becomes a historical and collective problem as well. Another decisive point is that Jung does not treat evil only as a raw impulse. He sees that it can also come mixed with high ideals, moral language, and good justifications. Evil rarely introduces itself by its own name. Very often, it dresses itself as duty, honesty, justice, protection, or purity. A person may act cruelly while believing they are only correcting someone. They may destroy in the name of good. They may humiliate in the name of truth. They may dominate in the name of order. This is one of the reasons why Jung insists on evil as a psychic reality. Evil is not only what consciousness easily condemns. It also appears in sophisticated, rational, and even socially admired forms. When it is not recognized in its concrete form, it becomes much harder to see clearly. This perspective also sheds new light on religion and traditional morality. Jung does not reject the language of good and evil, but he rejects its simplification. If evil is treated only as a lack of light, consciousness runs the risk of not taking seriously the destructive power that really exists in the soul. In some of his writings, he even suggests that the image of the divine itself needs to be thought of in a less one-sided way, precisely because the human experience of the sacred has always touched not only what is good, but also what is terrible, ambiguous, and unsettling. That does not mean glorifying evil. It means giving up a childish view of psychic reality. The human soul is not organized only around what is pleasant, virtuous, and clear. It contains tension, conflict, and forces that challenge every easy idea of purity. But recognizing evil as a psychic reality does not mean surrendering to it. That point is essential. Jung is not proposing cynicism, fatalism, or the abandonment of ethics. Quite the opposite. A more serious moral life becomes possible only when we admit that evil really exists within the human condition. The person who knows what they are capable of becomes more watchful. The person who knows their own aggression is more likely not to be ruled by it. A person who recognizes their envy can begin to stop disguising it as justice. The person who sees their desire to hurt can no longer hide so easily behind innocence. Recognition does not eliminate evil, but it reduces its invisibility. Maybe that is the most demanding part of the lesson. Jung does not want the person to see themselves as pure, but as responsible. And responsibility begins only when the illusion of innocence starts to weaken. Evil, seen as a psychic reality, forces the individual to give up the fantasy that having correct ideas is enough to protect them from their own darkness. It is not enough to think about the good. It is not enough to speak about virtue. It is not enough to condemn evil in others. One must face the fact that within the soul there is a force that can turn against others, against oneself, and even against everything consciousness claims to value. Jung's seriousness lies in his refusal of easy comfort. He does not allow evil to dissolve into a convenient abstraction. He forces us to see it as something living, active, seductive, and concrete within psychic life. And that is hard because it breaks the idealized image many people have of themselves. But it is also freeing because only what is recognized can truly be confronted. The greatest danger is not admitting that evil exists within us. The greatest danger is needing so badly to deny it that we silently allow it to act with even greater freedom precisely where consciousness is most proud of believing it is good. Not every spiritual crisis begins with a simple loss of faith. Sometimes it begins with an excess of inner life. A person keeps living, working, talking, and keeping up appearances, but inside, something begins to feel broken. The old certainties no longer hold, identity feels less solid, and the inner world becomes strange, filled with images, fears, symbolic voices, and questions that ordinary reason cannot answer. Jung took this kind of experience more seriously than almost any modern thinker. For him, there were moments when the soul was forced to descend into deeper regions of itself, and that descent was nothing comfortable. It could involve dark inner visions, a feeling of disintegration, encounters with disturbing figures, and a kind of symbolic disorder that shook the very center of consciousness. This idea is especially powerful because it destroys the fantasy that spiritual growth is always peace, light, and elevation. Jung shows something much harsher. At certain moments, the path to inner transformation begins with disorganization. A person does not rise before first descending. They do not find new meaning before losing the old one. They do not become more whole before passing through some form of fragmentation. In this view, a spiritual crisis is not only a religious problem, but a deep psychic experience in which the ego can no longer carry by itself the weight of the forces rising from the unconscious. That is why the image of descent is so important. To descend into the unconscious means, at least for a time, giving up the illusion that rational consciousness explains everything we are. It means coming into contact with contents that do not obey linear logic. Archaic images, symbols of death and rebirth, threatening figures, intense feelings of fear, guilt, strangeness, and disorientation. The unconscious does not speak like a philosophical treatise. It speaks through scenes, characters, atmospheres, and inner confrontations. And when that language breaks through with force, a person may feel like someone who has left familiar ground and entered a territory where their usual maps no longer work. This experience is frightening because it threatens the unity of the self. The ego likes to see itself as stable, coherent, and clear. But in a deep spiritual crisis, that stability can fail. A person begins to go through contradictory emotional states, intense feelings, haunting images, and ideas that seem to come from a deeper place than ordinary thought. What used to be simply me becomes more ambiguous. There comes a sense that there is an inner life larger, older, and more unsettling than conscious identity was willing to admit. And this can feel almost like collapse. Not necessarily an outward collapse that everyone can see, but the collapse of the old inner structure. Jung understood that this kind of rupture can be spiritually decisive precisely because it destroys the illusion of a self-sufficient consciousness. As long as a person remains trapped only at the surface, they may function well enough, but they remain cut off from their deeper layers. Crisis forces them to see that the soul is not made only of clear ideas and well-formed intentions. It also contains dark images, obscure impulses, old wounds, disturbing fantasies, and forces that escape the direct control of reason. The descent into the unconscious is painful because it reveals that wider inner reality. Suddenly, the person is faced with contents they did not choose to carry, but that still belong to them. This helps explain why so many spiritual crises come with fear. And not just any fear, but a more radical kind. Fear of losing identity, fear of going mad, fear of being invaded by something unknown, fear of discovering within oneself regions that seem incompatible with the image one had of oneself. There is also the fear of meaninglessness. When the old symbols stop working and the new ones have not yet been born, the soul passes through a deeply painful interval. The person no longer fully believes in what once sustained them, but also does not yet know what new inner form they will be able to lean on. They are left between worlds, and that in-between state is profoundly destabilizing. The dark side of this journey lies in the fact that it forces consciousness to live with inner images that are not comforting at all. Instead of revealing only hidden wisdom, the unconscious may present ruins, blood, threatening figures, accusing voices, scenes of death, falling, chaos, and disintegration. That does not mean the soul is simply getting worse. It means deep contents are trying to emerge in symbolic form. The problem is that before a symbol is understood, it can be experienced as a raw threat. A person feels the intensity of what is coming up before finding language for it. And that is what makes the crisis both dangerous and transformative. From a philosophical point of view, This brings Jung close to a very old tradition in which self-knowledge is not treated as mere intellectual clarity, but as a passage through something difficult. The soul must pass through nights, labyrinths, abysses, losses, and confrontations in order to reach another level of integration. Wisdom is not born only from orderly reasoning, but from the ability to endure contact with what throws us into disorder. Jung gives this ancient theme a modern psychological form. He shows that the descent into the underworld does not have to remain only a mythical metaphor. It can be a real experience of inner life. But there is one essential caution here. Jung does not romanticize disintegration. He does not turn psychic suffering into some noble spectacle, nor does he suggest that every rupture is automatically a sign of depth. What he shows is that certain crises carry symbolic and transformative potential, as long as the person can move through them without being completely destroyed by them. The descent into the unconscious is not a reckless dive into darkness. It is a lived experience that requires reflection, language, and above all, some living relationship between the ego and what is emerging. Without that, the risk is that the person gets lost in chaos instead of turning it into meaning. Maybe the most human part of this view is the recognition that the spirit can also become sick when the soul grows too narrow. Sometimes a spiritual crisis is not a sign of failure, but a sign that inner life is demanding a deeper truth than the current personality can carry. The suffering appears because something old is breaking apart, while the new has not yet taken shape. That is why symbolic disintegration hurts so much. It is not simply an end, but an interval in which the soul is letting go of old images without yet possessing new ones that can guide it. There is a very seductive fantasy surrounding self-knowledge. The idea that looking inward means finding peace, essence, clarity, and some intimate truth that will finally put everything in order. Jung never treated this journey in such a comfortable way. For him, knowing yourself is not only about discovering hidden qualities, repressed talents, or bright inner potential. It also means moving closer to difficult regions of the soul, where contradictions, fears, destructive impulses, morally troubling desires, and wounds that consciousness would rather avoid are living. Self-knowledge, then, is not only liberation, it is also risk. And it is precisely because it is risky that it becomes necessary. This idea completely changes the tone of the inner search. Instead of a romantic path toward an idealized version of yourself, Jung proposes a more serious passage. A human being is not made only of noble intentions and clear thoughts. They also carry a shadow. They carry complexes. They carry unconscious forces. They carry ancient inner images that do not always fit with the identity they would like to maintain. To know yourself, then, means giving up the vanity of appearing inwardly simple. It means admitting that the soul is broader, more ambiguous, and more dangerous than the ego would like to believe. That is why self-knowledge is frightening. As long as a person stays on the surface, they can preserve a certain story about themselves. I am balanced. I am fair. I am rational. I am different from those who lose themselves. But once they begin looking more deeply, that image may break apart. Envy appears where there seemed to be only a sense of justice. Vanity appears where there seemed to be only self-respect. Aggression appears where there seemed to be only honesty. The desire to dominate appears where there seemed to be only care. And the hardest blow is not only noticing these things, but recognizing that they are not totally foreign accidents. They belong to the very structure of the personality. Jung understands that this discovery is morally humiliating, and that is exactly why it can be transformative. A person who has never met their own dark side runs the risk of being ruled by it without knowing it. A person who has never recognized their own ability to wound, dominate, envy, or destroy goes on believing that these impulses belong only to others. And then projection begins. Everything the person cannot bear to see in themselves is placed outside. Evil always takes someone else's face. The enemy is always external. Consciousness feels clean, but becomes blind. In that sense, self-knowledge is a necessity because it reduces that blindness. It does not make a person pure. It makes them less naive. But Jung does not idealize this process. There is real risk in descending inward without preparation, without honesty, and without the ability to symbolize what is found. The unconscious does not contain only what is useful or inspiring. It can also bring confusion, fear, destructive fascination, and disorganization. A person who comes into contact with the deeper regions of the psyche without being able to bear the tension between what they discover and the image they had of themselves may be taken over by despair, denial, or inflation. Either they run from what they saw, trying to return to the old illusion, or they identify too strongly with their own darkness, as if the truth about themselves were nothing but an abyss. Jung rejects both extremes, neither the escape into innocence nor surrender to chaos. This is where the true demand of self-knowledge appears, learning how to look without being swallowed. That may be one of the most serious formulations in Jung's thought. Seeing the inner abyss does not mean falling into it. Recognizing your shadow does not mean obeying it. Discovering dark impulses does not mean turning them into your identity. The goal is not to glorify darkness, but to integrate it into consciousness so that it stops acting in an invisible and automatic way. The mature person, in this view, is not the one who has eliminated all conflict, but the one who has developed some ability to live with their own complexity without lying to themselves. This view brings Jung close to a very old philosophical tradition. Know yourself was never, in its deepest form, an invitation to self-admiration. It always carried something of a test, of discipline, of confrontation. Socrates already knew that the human soul resists the truth about itself. The Stoics insisted on inner watchfulness because passions distort judgment. Nietzsche showed that consciousness likes to hide less noble motives behind elevated words. Jung gathers these insights and gives them psychological depth. The self is not transparent to itself, and the inner journey is less about contemplating a pure essence than about confronting the real division within psychic life. That is also why self-knowledge is a necessity. Without it, a person remains vulnerable to their own projections, to their own complexes, to the seduction of the crowd, to archetypal images that may capture them, to stories that feed their moral vanity. A person who does not know their own fragility imagines they are stronger than they really are. A person who does not know their own aggression believes they will never be unjust. A person who does not know their own neediness becomes its slave in relationships. A person who does not know their hunger for recognition may give their whole life to the desperate search for approval. Not knowing yourself feels like protection, but it is really only unconscious dependence. At the same time, Jung forces us to admit that total self-knowledge does not exist. The soul never becomes completely transparent. Something dark will always remain, something that escapes, something that reveals itself slowly through dreams, crises, relationships, and conflicts. That makes the task even more human. To know yourself is not to complete some final inventory of who you are, but to keep a living relationship with what in you refuses to fit into any simple definition. True self-knowledge does not produce perfection. It produces watchfulness, humility, and a certain depth. Maybe that is why Jung treats this journey as a vital necessity and not as an intellectual luxury. Not knowing yourself is too dangerous. It means living under the control of forces acting in the shadows. It means mistaking impulse for destiny, projection for truth, and the mask for identity. But knowing yourself is also risky because it means losing cherished illusions, enduring shame, recognizing inner contradictions, and accepting that there is more inside you than your self-image could tolerate. The soul becomes larger, but also more difficult. In the end, self-knowledge in Jung is not a promise of comfort, but a demand of maturity. It asks for the courage to give up the fantasy of purity and endure the encounter with the inner abyss without turning it into a tyrant. Because the problem is not discovering that this abyss exists. The real danger is ignoring it and going on living as if consciousness alone were enough to protect us from what, silently, continues growing in the dark. Thank you for staying until the end and for giving your time to such a deep reflection. In a world that almost always pushes us towards speed and surface-level thinking, stopping to look more seriously at the human mind is already, by itself, something rare. If this video made you think, feel, or see something in a new way, now is a great time to subscribe to the channel. That really helps support the work and helps this content reach more people who are also looking for deep, human, and life-changing reflections. Also leave a like, because that shows YouTube that this video deserves to be recommended. Share it with someone who enjoys psychology, philosophy, and self-knowledge, because sometimes a single conversation can open important doors inside a person. And I really want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below telling me which of Jung's ideas affected you the most, or which one best describes something you have already noticed in yourself or in other people. Your comment can add a lot to the discussion and make this space even more alive. And do not leave the channel just yet. Stay here and keep watching the next videos, because there are still many deep ideas to explore about Jung, philosophy, the human mind, and self-knowledge. See you in the next video.